Good evening, everybody. Thank you for joining me virtually at any rate. This is not at all what we all imagined we'd be doing tonight. We did not think we would be social distancing. We did not know we would be in the middle of this crisis, but maybe there have been lots of indications that we should have known some kind of crisis like this was coming down the pipe. I think, in giving this talk tonight on dereliction, destitution, and dispossession, I'm very aware of the fact that a global pandemic of the kind that we are experiencing is, in fact, creating all kinds of avenues towards dereliction, destitution, and dispossession for people who are always subject to exactly this kind of collapse, and so I offer it on behalf of a sense that we should all emerge from this crisis not to go back to business as normal, but to take full advantage of the fact that systems are not working, big business is collapsing. Capitalism is in free fall, and there's this tiny opening here for imagining something else. And a lot of my work, some people may know, even though some of it is in a dark and negative vein on failure and other kinds of, negative forms of practice, my work has also been about looking for alternative ways of being, and that is the basis for the new work that I want to share with you tonight. So I'm going to pivot a little bit here towards the presentation. You'll see I have prepared a keynote presentation to give you some imagery of a series of art practices from the 1970s that, when faced with the collapsing infrastructure of cities, of political ways of life, of post-war promises of prosperity and so on, began to argue not for making the world a better place, not for collaborating in order to build worlds, but a whole series of aesthetic actors began to argue that we should be unmaking the world, the unjust world within which we found ourselves. There's no better time, in my opinion, to go back and think again about unbuilding. So I hope that you'll join me here. So for a little while, I've been looking at the work, particularly of 1970s artists, an architect, Gordon Matta Clark, but also an African-American photographer, Alvin Baltrop, whose photograph you see here as the gateway to my PowerPoint presentation. And while Gordon Matta Clark was a trained architect who tried to use his architectural training to figure out how to unbuild the built environment, Alvin Baltrop, on the other hand, was someone who went into the collapsed architectures of the New York piers on the west side of New York City. And while he did take pictures of gay men having sex, a lot of his images, as you see in the first one that I'm showing here, were also of what collapse allows. So the hole in the wall, even as it is it's a whole trope about, if you look above the spray painting artist, you also see a phallus. This is very much a kind of gay male erotic portal. There's also a sense that where things begin to fall apart, you can catch glimpses of new and different realities that are not new, shiny realities, but are in fact part and parcel of the collapse. So we want to think about the collapse at this moment of collapse and see where it takes us. We're going to lean into the collapse rather than try to pull out of it in order to re-erect the normal. We want to actually take our distance from the normal and see whether in the ruins and with the ruins, staying with the ruins offers us a different perspective on being, making, doing, and imagining. And this is a beautiful image, as far as I'm concerned, of Gordon Matta Clark taking pictures within the piers where he was about to make one of his last great works, which is called Day's End, and is actually was being before the pandemic, being remade across from the Whitney on the west side, beyond their West Side Highway. David Hammond has asked the Whitney to recreate Gordon Matta Clark's Day's End, which was built in 1974. And Day's End, as we'll see later in the presentation, was the carving of huge spaces into the collapsed piers that allowed for a play of light and water within this dark space. But I really like this image also because it shows that there are other aesthetics available, that this is not just rubble and ruin, collapse and disorder. There's another aesthetic here, and it's an aesthetic that we should try to wrap our heads around. And I'm thinking here of James C. Scott's work in Seeing Like a State, when he reminds us that part of the work of ideology in the modern period has been to make us commit to an aesthetic that is in love with order and symmetry and correctness and structure. And I'm suggesting we need to pull away from modernist architectures and start looking at ruins, ruination, and so on. So this is just a little funny meme to suggest that there is a kind of temporal analog for what I'm suggesting: the order, the symmetry, the propulsive move forward that modernism demands and the futures imagined by modernism led up to, which is this sort of Nike swoosh telling us to just do it. What if we just don't do it? What if, especially in this moment where we're all in sheltering in place, some of us locked down, some of us sick, some of us struggling, but we're at least not doing the business of everyday life? What happens when we just don't do it? Do other possibilities emerge to take the place of the Nike swoosh and its endless emphasis on propulsive doing, being, practicing, making? I want to linger with the undoing and the unmaking and the not practicing. I think that a lot of the work that I'm doing in this new project is indebted to the late Jose Munoz, who you will remember from Cruising Utopia, in order to focus upon what he called this ever-receding horizon of utopian potential, went back to the 1970s. And in many ways, Jose's utopian glimpse of utopia comes from the 1970s. And if you go back and read that book, it's Fred Harko jumping out of a window, and Ray Johnson's mailing projects. It's a lot of 1970s, 1960s, 1970s work. He goes back in order to catch a glimpse of a utopia that was imagined then but never came to be. Under those circumstances, futurity, as he says, becomes history's dominant principle. And that very quick glimpse you got, I'm not going to go back because I don't want to interrupt any kind of technological balance that we have right now. I had an image for a minute of how completely destitute, derelict really, New York City was in the 1970s. And it's something that we should remember at this moment where we've been told, right, for decades, courtesy of Mayor Giuliani and Mayor Bloomberg and these various billionaire mayors have told us that they were running on a lifestyle ticket, that they were remaking the city, that they were going to give us a bigger, better, brighter, cleaner city. And here we are with the city that they created, one that has not enough hospital beds for people, one that cannot offer people safety, sanctuary, or anything. So we might look back at the 1970s where at a moment of sort of maximum collapse and think again about what was possible then and what possibilities did not come into being. Why destitution? So destitution, here I'm thinking with, and You may not be huge fans of the Invisible Committee, and that's okay, neither am I necessarily. But in their latest manifesto, which is called Now, they have some great ideas about why we should destitute the system as it currently exists. So here's a quote from them. They say in the manifesto Now, it is only from the destituent standpoint that one can grasp all that is incredibly constructive in the breakage. So I really, if you think back to that first image I showed you, the Alvin Baltrop image of the gay man peering through a portal, a broken piece of wall, it's in that kind of gaze that we find this destituent standpoint that doesn't seek to rebuild and repair, but is interested in the breakage itself. And I'll tell you, I'm going to be much more concrete about why we might be interested in the breakage, because I know this sounds abstract and just like, oh yeah, good idea, but where does that get us, particularly in this moment? So they argue in, the Invisible Committee argues in Now that we should, and this is, I believe, chapter 4, destitute the world. And notice that destitution is being used here as a verb. Let's destitute the world, which is not quite the same as destitution. Destitution is a state of complete dispossession that people are forced into. To destitute something, however, is to seek to ruin it. So they give us a couple of examples of why we should destitute institutions, and this absolutely builds upon earlier work by the Invisible Committee against institutions, which I won't go into, but we can just play out a few of these scenarios of destitution. So they say, for example, to destitute the judicial system is to learn to settle our disputes ourselves, applying some method to this, paralyzing its faculty of judgment and driving its henchmen from our lives. At a moment when people who are at most risk of this illness are in prisons, many of them not for good reasons at all, I think that there are so many reasons right now to think about destituting a judicial system which, as the New York Times was reporting just 2 weeks ago, is absolutely populated by right-wing judges that Trump has put in place. So we need another way of settling disputes and figuring out how to manage living with large numbers of people of varying levels of ability, of income, of opportunity. But the judicial system is clearly not working. This is a harder one, the next one, if you can see it, to destitute medicine, especially at a moment when we see doctors and nurses working on the very front lines of this pandemic to save lives. It sounds counterintuitive to say destitute medicine. When they say this, and when I repeat destitute medicine, no one is talking about destituting doctors and nurses. What is under discussion here is the system of medicine that has been established through the collaboration of insurance companies on the one hand and the pharmaceutical companies on the other, such that doctors and nurses have been reduced until this moment, in fact, to handing out pills, and then we all throw up our hands when we see that we have an opioid epidemic. So to destitute medicine is to remember all the different moments in history when, say, people who in the past were called witches actually passed on and had themselves these kind of arcane knowledges based upon plant life and other kinds of knowledge that allowed them to heal. So we want to destitute medicine on behalf of healing. We also, need to understand better how to manage the health of populations rather than just all being subject to the calculations of insurance companies. Anyone who sees Trump standing up on the news night after night, contradicting the experts that are in place to try to manage this crazy situation that we find ourselves in, I think has to agree that we should be thinking about the dysfunction of the government right now. We have just decided practically not to make Bernie Sanders into the Democratic candidate. Sanders is the only one talking about healthcare for all. Bernie Sanders is the only one who seems to have any handle on how to manage a national disaster of this size. And yet he's pushed to one side, and in the meantime, we hear nothing from Joe Biden. That's governance that is, absolutely dysfunctional. So they say to destitute the government is to make ourselves ungovernable. Who said anything about winning? And I can't even read my own slide here. I think it says overcoming is everything. Finally, and here we are outside of the halls of the university, not meeting in person. It's hard to say destitute the university when here we are virtually trying to stay in touch, trying intellectually to continue to circulate ideas at a time when ideas seem to be in short supply. But the university, it seems to me, also needs to change in its mission, change in terms of the way in which it is only really available to the very rich and the very elite. And maybe some of our online communities will be the basis for new realms of what Moten and Hani call study. Study being what people do together, separate from the institutional structures that mandate certain forms of research and certain modes of interrogation. So that's destitution. It's absolutely of a piece with Moten and Hani's Undercommons, for those of you who have read the Undercommons and who feel called by that particular text. The point about disruption is not simply that it's something that people are calling for. It's something, destitution is something that is ongoing. And you can hear that sense that always in the Undercommons of a new political order that is emergent rather than just under construction somewhere in an undisclosed location. That's not what it is. It's already happening. Always in Moten and Hani, it's already there. It's already happening. So they say, we are the general antagonism to politics looming outside every attempt to politicize every imposition of governance, every sovereign decision in its degraded miniature, every emergent state and home sweet home. We are disruption and we consent to disruption. We preserve upheaval. We consent to disruption. That's the orientation of a new understanding of the political that I think we're all going to have to get behind, especially if in the coming months Trump sees that he has, zero support from the population and decides to postpone elections or some such authoritarian move. We need to be disruption. We need to consent to disruption. And this is that temporality that I'm talking about in Moten and Hani, a derelict temporality, which is we're already here, moving. We've been around. We're more than politics, more than settled, more than democratic. We surround democracy's false image in order to unsettle it. Every time it tries to enclose us, and enclosure is the thing that we want to avoid here. If enclosure is one of the main techniques of capitalism, we're looking, even though we are ourselves subject to enclosure right now, we want to move towards some sort of opening, that portal that was in the first image I showed, and so on. All right, they say every time it tries to represent our will, we're unwilling. So I want to ask you to think about what would a coalition of the unwilling look like? And I actually have an answer for that. And again, I'm going to go back to an earlier moment in queer politics. This is pre-social media. It was in the 1990s, and it was at another moment of sort of political disappointment when Bush ran two different campaigns that we could not believe that, George W. Bush had any chance of being elected, and yet he was. However, in 1992 and 1996, you could have voted, instead of for George Bush, for Joan Jett Black. Joan Jett Black was a powerful, creative, imaginative, innovative drag queen from the Bay Area. And in 1992, she led what I'm calling a coalition of the unwilling. She ran a campaign in 1992 for the Queer Nation Party called, Joan Jett for President, with the slogan, Lick Bush in 92. Don't know why she didn't win. That seems like a good slogan to me, But she came back stronger 4 years later, 1996. She's like, oh, forget it. We're not doing this Lick Bush Queer Nation Party. Bullshit. Her new party was the Black Pantsuit Party. And her new slogan was, by any means necessary. And there she is, sitting in her wicker chair, looking very Black Panther, if not Black Pantsuit. And she had an actual campaign. And this is the campaign. This is the campaign that we can clearly identify as a coalition of the unwilling. She said, in any given election, 50% of the population does not vote or cannot vote. And that includes felons, people who've been in jail, people who are in jail, people who are too young, people who are too old, people who are sick, poor people who can't get to the polls, can't get away from their jobs, poor people in neighborhoods where there aren't enough polling stations. You add it up. That is, by any definition, a coalition, untapped coalition of the unwilling. Joan Jett Black said, I am running for you. If you want me for president, don't vote. She then went to Iowa, and in the Iowa primary, 440,000 people did not vote. She took those non-votes and declared victory. And that is what a political campaign oriented to dereliction, built upon a coalition of the unwilling, looks like. Tear it all down, take the 50% who do not believe in the system, more than 50% most of the time, and start a new political system with that majority. That's where we're going. Okay, second, and I don't know, I think I have 4 points, so I'll move through this one a little bit more quickly so that we can, get all of these pieces together by the end. So dereliction, unlike destitution, which has much more of a connotation around people being completely without resources, dereliction is about literally unbuilding of the built environment. And that, of course, is where Gordon Matta Clark comes in. Gordon Matta Clark in the 1970s was part of a group that was called the Anarchitecture Group that apparently, according to Mark Wigley, only met once, but it had all kinds of projects on the Lower East Side of New York City. Matta Clark had grown up in New York City at the time that I was talking about earlier, a moment of intense poverty and crumbling infrastructures in the city, restructuring and so on in the 1970s. And he was the son of a Chilean artist, Roberto Mata, and when his parents had separated, he ended up in New York City with his mother and his twin brother, and this New York that he grew up in had a massive effect on him. He went to Cornell in the late 60s, early 70s, thinking that he was going to train and become an architect. Quite influenced here by his father, who had worked with Le Corbusier in Europe. But his father became very disenchanted with Le Corbusier. And in fact, Matta Clark set up in opposition to Le Corbusier. And I'll explain that in a moment. And if Le Corbusier imagined himself as the modernist architect who was carrying out all of those projects that James C. Scott describes in Sing Like a State, that build an environment and then allow for a kind of ideology to evolve from within it, an ideology about symmetry and order and management and so on, structure, really. Gordon Matta Clark was the opposite, and he was deeply interested, you could say, in the dynamics of collapse. So this group met several times. This particular image is of a project they had called Food, in which people would simply meet, bring food, eat food. And there's a kind of sense of sharing a project that is an anathema to capitalism, redistributing resources, another project that we cannot at all seem to manage in this moment of crisis, and an understanding that in any neighborhood, some people are eating and have food to spare, and other people have nothing. And so this food project, you can find versions of it in many, many different art groups. The one that I know about is Wu Sang, the trans artist, MacArthur Fellow, brilliant performance installation artist. In the 2010s in LA, would also do a food project, go and buy for very little money fresh food at the Hollywood market, and then invite people to come and share the food. So there was a food project, and there are a number of other projects. The real heart of that group, however, was Gordon Matta Clark. And here's the opposition to Le Corbusier. Le Corbusier imagined a world that could be controlled from the imposition of structures. And he said things like, a house is a machine for living in. He also said, everything must hold together or else it will collapse. He also said, and this is the heteronormative piece, man must be built upon this axis of harmony in perfect agreement with nature and probably the universe. He collaborated with the Nazis. There's a kind of fascism to his architecture, and everything about Le Corbusier is what Matta Clark came to contest. And these are some projects that I'm not going to go into these right now, but there are various colonial projects that follow the, these long lines, the boulevards that are built to create these straight lines, the grid of Manhattan, for example, versus other colonized sites that are seen as messy, even though that messiness might harbor within it a completely different understanding of order, power, and community. Matta Clark didn't say everything must hold together or it will collapse. He said he wanted to find a place somewhere between the supports and collapse. And that is the principle of an architecture. Not simply pulling everything down, but ideologically, intellectually, conceptually, thinking about a place that is somewhere between the supports and the collapse. And that's the Matta Clark project. And I want to also suggest that there's a lot of queerness and transness to Matta Clark, and I've written a whole essay about the transgender implications of Matta Clark's work. Because if you think, and this is a very, very familiar metaphor of the building as being like a body, that Le Corbusier idea that the building should represent nature, it also plays out in the way in which the architect is always male. Think of Ayn Rand's, protagonist in The Fountainhead. And the building is always cast as female. The female body is a dwelling place for another being, and so on. By bringing buildings to the point of collapse, Matta Clark was also bringing a gender system down. He was also finding some of the ways in which the gender system is basically, it adheres to the built environment. And when you begin to pull that environment apart, you also create space for these non-binary and trans formulations. Just to give you one example of a kind of anti-real estate project that Matta Clark did that I still think is super interesting. This was called false estates. So instead of real estate, false estates. And he bought a whole bunch of little tiny micro parcels of land. And in any city, there are hundreds of thousands of these that are little corners of people's yards or people's garage or whatever, that the city, for whatever reason, didn't sell with that lot. And those little micro lots he bought up with the one stipulation being that they could not be inhabited and could not be occupied. So he was literally trying to buy up land that could never be occupied. So it's a kind of de-occupation, de-colonial project. For people who are interested in a kind of architectural turn in queer and trans studies, I would refer you back to Paul Preciado. And this is going to take us now towards the political project of dereliction. Paul Preciado wrote a fantastic book as his thesis, his architecture PhD thesis at Princeton University called Pornotopia, in which he argued that post-war masculinity, just like the way in which power was being imagined within modernism through the built environment, post-war masculinity was also imagined in terms of architecture. And he gave us the example of Playboy, the Playboy mansions, where men went to get away from their families and away from their wives and away from the suburbs, and I should say white men here, white men with money, white men with resources, built the suburbs, put their wife and their child there, and then fled and have these other architectures to go and Playboy in, the Playboy mansion. So in a way, Pornotopia pushes us towards understanding post-war masculinity as an architectural project, which then leads us to understand that if we want to pull patriarchy down, we're going to have to unbuild it, unmake it. And that's not going to be done one person at a time through a Me Too movement. It's a structural unbuilding that needs to occur. But the person who said this long before Preciado, of course, was Audre Lorde. And for a long time, I've been, pondering this, one of Lorde's most famous quotes, which is, "For the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house," and thinking about how weird it is that when we cite that quotation, all of the emphasis is on the master's tools. It's like, well, what would be a good tool? What strategy should we use? But then we miss the other end of the sentence. The project here is not picking the right tool. The project is to dismantle the master's house. And in my project that I'm working on, that is one of these fundamental and architectural statements. It holds within it a whole project of unbuilding and unmaking. And we're going to wave goodbye in a moment to Gordon Matta Clark. I just wanted you to get a sense of what his projects look like and why they do kind of hold out some of that utopian promise that we find in Munoz's work. So here we are in the playground of many, many gay men pre-AIDS crisis. And I like to say that rather than using Stonewall as our point of liberation, which I think is sort of nonsense in a lot of different ways, we should be thinking about this landscape of the piers, which were abandoned, which were collapsing, which were derelict, which were made up of dispossessed communities, the homeless, the drug addicted, gay, unhoused people lived in the piers at that time. And it's there that we should really look for some of the roots of a revolution whose time has not yet come. Matta Clark's motto was "nothing works." And what he did was he kind of built these slices of nothing into the sides of architectural structures. And the idea was that just because the piers were a place that were populated by dispossessed people doesn't mean that there shouldn't be architectural elements that made them beautiful. And so he wanted to let the light in and let the light come in and play on the water. It's no accident, mind you, that Samuel Delaney's memoir from that very period in which he reminisces on his own sexual exploits in the piers is called The Motion of Light on Water. And it's really hard for me not to think that that title in some way comes, and I got to go back and read The Motion of Light and Water again. It's got to be a reference to the Gordon Matta Clark cutting called Day's End. Okay, and I just want to close out this section then. Here are some images by Alvin Baltrop of the piers, and you can see these collapsing architectures are in fact so beautiful. I mean, they are dangerous, and they are full of the possibility of collapse at any moment, but they're anarchitectural in the sense that they're not simply collapsing. They hold together, but they're at the point of collapse. And remember, that was Matta Clark's definition. All right. The piers also contained incredible artworks, and this is pre the art market. This is a David Wojnarowicz mural at Pier 34. And then finally, this is Day's End, the Matta Clark cut as photographed by Alvin Baltrop. So that's dereliction for you. That's unbuilding. That's finding the point of collapse and not seeking to rebuild, but thinking about life in the ruins, life among dispossessed populations, and architecture for everybody. And here's one of Baltrop's. This is a great image. I don't think you can see it in this image, but a lot of Baltrop's images are of the actual architecture of the piers, the collapsed architecture of the piers. And it's only when you search around in the architecture and the rubble that you, in every single photograph of his, you'll find two men having sex. In this one, I can't actually see it, but in a few of them here, you can see the men they're just specks. And there's something about the scale that I think he's actually trying to image, the relationship of the human to these incredible architectures that we're surrounded by, how small we are in relationship to visible and invisible structures that we inhabit and that inhabit us. And today, all we have, instead of the piers, instead of the gestural mechanisms of cruising, instead of the anti-capitalist temporalities of cruising, we have Grindr. And Grindr is, in fact, the scooping up of the sexual energy of cruising and the transformation of all of that libidinal energy into cash. All right, so my last section will be really short. So here, I just want to linger for a moment on the question of gender, because so far it's been pretty much, revolutionary males leading the way to dereliction, destitution. So what about the girls? And here I'm also going to go back to the 1970s. But before that, I just want to remind you, and I'm sure this is a book that you're now all familiar with, of a recent text that finds anarchistic expression in the actions and peregrinations of Black girls in New York City. And that book, of course, is Wayward Lives, Beautiful Experiments, Intimate Histories of Social Upheaval by Saidiya Hartman. And one of the arguments of this gorgeous, important book, this book that is so important to us now and is written about the same city, about New York City and Philadelphia, is that we're looking in the wrong places for texts and examples of political revolution and anarchy. And so she says, if you examine the little bits of writing that some of these women were able to leave behind, or the case histories that describe the Black women who came to New York City and Philadelphia looking for a better way of life and then finding themselves pressed into domestic servitude again, in their wanderings, in their desire for beautiful things, in their pursuit of pleasure, theater, sex, cabaret, she says, in that pursuit of beauty is where we would find the key texts of anarchism. And it's a beautiful way of arguing for the intimacy, the intimate histories of social upheaval that have been erased by our focus on big master canonical texts. So if we follow this waywardness, the waywardness that Hartman tracks, we can find a couple of examples in the 1970s and 80s of feminist projects that were completely committed to social upheaval, but that have been kind of forgotten both within feminist and within queer cultural histories. So the first one is Born in Flames. And, lots of people do know about Born in Flames, but I know that when I tried to show it to my students a couple of years ago, they didn't really, it didn't really speak to them. They weren't taken with it in the way that I am every time I watch it again. Born in Flames it was a film made by Lizzie Borden in a film collective about revolutionary women's groups in the wake of a socialist revolution, who feel that even though the socialist revolution has happened, nothing has changed for women. And the Black women in particular decide that the only way to change the society is to pick up a gun. And remarkably, in the middle of this film, one of the protagonists goes off to the Middle East to get trained by a revolutionary cell there and to do an arms deal so that she can bring guns back and bring the guns out, distribute the guns so that there can be this armed feminist revolt. I mean, it's kind of unthinkable in the versions of feminist films that we have now, which tend to be neoliberal affairs about leaning into this or that job. And so Born in Flames is a really good film to go back and look at. It's set in New York City at the very time that I'm was referring to in terms of Gordon Matta Clark and Alvin Baltrop. It's the same New York City that's crumbling. It's the same New York City full of artists who are dreaming of different worlds. I'm not saying better worlds. It's not an improvement narrative. It's a narrative about pulling everything down and then having a clearer vision of what should come next. And if this works, I'm going to play you the trailer for Born in Flames.
We are interrupting this program to bring you a special message from the Women's Army.
Which would you rather see come through the door? One lion, unified, or 500 mice? All oppressed people have a right to violence.
The working class about its name of America's mystery.
Why is it called Woman's Army?
A manifesto strong in the sentimental room, talking about a declaration in an undercover nation. She's got a black jack, a wings of a dove. She's got a higher fist and a velvet glove. Just got addicted 'cause the red ones do. Wake up, could this be you? Could this be you? All right.
All right, so that's a trailer for Born in Flames. I encourage you all to go and look and see it if you haven't seen it yet. Borden said, she was interested in a sort of dystopian future film, but she didn't want to make a conventional science fiction film. But in the end, if you go to the end of the quote, she said, "This is science fiction because I don't believe it will ever happen." And just the final thing I want to say about Born in Flames is, and you can find this in a whole dossier that was committed to a discussion of the film that was edited by Craig Wilsey and Dean Spade. And they point out that the film emerges out of some of the same conditions that we noted in relationship to Gordon Matta Clark: fiscal restructuring, reorientation within a neoliberal regime, the lack of government bailout after economic crisis and white flight, cutting of social services, reinvestment in banks and businesses, pulling back from industry, competition between women, people of color, and white men for jobs, and so on. All of that is a sort of backdrop out of which this film, as well as the art of dereliction that characterized Gordon Matta Clark and Alvin Baltrop's work, that's the fuel for all of this work happening at the same time. And the thing to say here is that the crumbling city also meant that it was a place that poor people could live, could afford to live. And so even as we're seeing the city falling down, we're also noting that a massive amount of art was produced in that period. Now I want to end this section by just telling you a little bit about another film that was also about revolutionary girls, wayward girls, who were on the run from the police, from the city, from social services. And I like to call this the greatest queer film that no one's ever seen. It's called Times Square, which is really cool if you think about it in relationship, again, to Samuel Delaney's Times Square Red, Times Square Blue. But while his book is so much about gay male sexual undergrounds, this film, remarkably, is about teenage girl undergrounds in the same period in New York City. The film has an incredible punk soundtrack and should have been a big hit. It was made by a director who, had a bit of a following, and Alan Moyle, and it starred two unknown girls, but the basic plot was that they met in a mental institution that they'd been placed in, and to the soundtrack of the Ramones singing "I Want to Be Sedated," they took off, ran off into the night, and made a home for themselves where? In the piers. And they lived this very punky life, going around the city, scavenging, dancing in X-rated clubs, and living in the piers. And it has within it some incredibly poignant and utopian moments. And I'm going to play you one such moment from the film in a second. But the last thing I want to say about this film is that this film found no audience. It was not seen as being particularly interesting at the time. It was made in 1979, came out in 1980. And has sort of disappeared without a trace, and is just revived every now and then. But it holds within it the memory of this other orientation to queerness that was deeply urban, that had a kind of punk sensibility, that was about dispossession and dereliction, and that was not about improvement, recognition, rights, families, middle-class status, but was really literally about being on the run. And the two girls in the film call themselves the Sleaze Sisters, and their relationship unfolds in the ruins of the piers. And here's a beautiful clip in which they sort of commit to each other. And this is just a slide saying that they are the sort of backdrop out of which the lesbian Avengers emerged. And here we go, Pier 56.
Let me look. The fucking bathtub. Hey, the back porch. Come on, Pam.
Now I see it. Why didn't I realize it before? God, now I see it. Don't you realize this is it? This is the place. I'll show you. Watch this. I had blood. Now give me yours. Come on, don't worry. I ain't gonna hurt you. Just relax. See? That's all. Now, I want you to listen to me. You ever feel like freaking? You get panicky, shaky? I want you to call my name. Just scream it. Scream it as loud as you can. You know, like this. Pammy! Pammy!
Nikki!
Louder.
Nikki!
Pammy!
Nikki!
Pammy!
Nikki!
Pammy!
Okay, beautiful. So you have this kind of gorgeous image at the end of these two young girls, young women calling each other's names, and the names echoing across the crumbling piers on the waterfront. That, you know, is the kind of the revolutionary horizon that Munoz talks about in Cruising Utopia. And it's also about this world that they're willing to make, a world where everything is salvaged, scavenged, communities are improvised, they come together, they fall apart. There's a completely different temporality. So Times Square, even though Times Square, the Times in Times Square refers, of course, to the location in New York City, there's also a sense of this other temporality at work. Okay, I want to end then quickly. I won't do this in great detail, but just to give us a kind of a way forward, I want to end with another 1970s utopian text, this time Ursula Le Guin's The Dispossessed. And I think this is a really great moment to think back on the work of Ursula Le Guin. I know a lot of people are meditating on it. Octavia Butler's Parable of the Sower at this moment, which is another great book to go to. But only Ursula Le Guin actually tried to imagine and weave a narrative around a potential anarchist society. And that's the plot of The Dispossessed. And the main character, Shevik, says in The Dispossessed, and here's where we get to that narrative around enclosure and opening. Those who build walls, Shevik says, are their own prisoners. I'm going to fulfill my proper function in the social organism. I am going to unbuild walls. So here we have the anarchist orientation is away from the enclosures of capitalism, the stealing of the commons, the occupation of native lands, and the orientation to an unbuilding, a decolonial ethic of ethos of unbuilding. So I want to tell you a little bit about the narrative of The Dispossessed for those of you who haven't read it. The Dispossessed concerns two planets. One, Eurus, is a capitalist planet, very similar to contemporary Earth. And the other one is a planet populated by a group of people who broke away and formed a different society, an opposite society, if you like, an anarchist society, under the teachings of somebody called Odo. And that planet is called Anurus. On Anurus, a physicist has discovered a theory of simultaneity, and the capitalist planet wants to bring him back to share his findings. When he goes back to the capitalist planet, he's only ever lived on his anarchist planet. He can't believe it, and at first he's really seduced by the opportunities in this capitalist society. He has privacy. He can do his own work. His intellectual labor is his own property. He can have sex. He drinks alcohol. He goes shopping, and he's besotted for half of the novel with the pleasures and the possibilities and the privacy available to him on the capitalist planet. But it's a turning point where he suddenly realizes that his ideas don't mean much in this world that he has found himself in, and that he misses the collectivity and the other kinds of opportunities for collective ownership that he had in Anurus. And at that moment, he's contacted by an underground group who ask him to come and speak at a demonstration, a revolutionary uprising that they're planning. So he goes to speak, and this is a speech that he gives, and this is where I want to sort of take us to by way of conclusion. In the speech, he says to the crowd gathered to rise up against the capitalist planet, he says, "We know that there is no help for us but from each other, that no hand will save us if we do not reach out our hand, and that the hand you reach out is as empty as mine is. You have nothing, you possess nothing, you own nothing, you are free. All you have is what you are and what you give." So the whole meaning of The Dispossessed in this amazing novel is that in a society based upon slavery and the management and ownership of labor by management, the only way towards liberation is the end of possession. You have to get rid of possession. You have to possess nothing, and only through possessing nothing can you access freedom. So I want to think about this as empty-handedness, that only with empty-handedness rather than with stuff and having can we access the kind of potential that we're interested in. And here I end with a image of a friend of mine with whom I sometimes collaborate, Boy Child, who, and even though this is not the performance that the photograph is of, I saw this performance, which is they call hand dancing. I call empty hand dancing. They did this performance at the Venice Biennale this year, outside of the paid areas and on a little knoll of grass that people just sort of knew about. And they did it every day for 2 weeks, this dance with no music, just whatever audience came along, no sound, and just the movement of hands, empty hands. Okay, so that's the lecture, and I know there are a lot of probably some of them contradictory ideas in here, but I really do think that as we shelter in place and as we find very little to comfort us from elected officials, government, as we turn to our neighbors and our friends and our support networks. I really do think this is the right time to think about dereliction, destitution, and dispossession. So I leave you with nothing, and the reminder, as Gordon Matt Clark said, that nothing matters. Thank you.